Starting in Romans chapter 1, verse 28, Paul says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, and unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." You guys can grab a seat. Romans chapter 1, we have been in here for a while. We haven't touched it in a good minute. And so I kind of just want to give you like a little brief overview to get us up to date of where Paul is at here in verses 28 through 32. But Paul has essentially writing to the Romans, and Paul is a great candidate to write to the church in Rome. You know, he is Roman himself. You know, he's had a mighty transformation in his life, right? He has been what we have just read. You know, the things that are not of God, the things that are not natural pertaining to God, but the things that are natural pertaining to man, right? The unrighteousness, the maliciousness, the deceit, the murder, all this was who Paul was, right? And I think for a lot of us in here this morning, that's who we were too, right? I'm not saying that's what you do or you have done, but that's who we were. You know, Corinthians talks about that, and he says, and Paul writing that as well, he says, "Such were some of you," after stating some of the things that we were, right? But me as a Christian, me who has been transformed just like Paul was on the road to Damascus, I no longer identify as these things, right? Do I still maybe fall into these things and stumble in these things and do these things? Yes, right? Like murder, for instance. Hear me out. I haven't murdered anyone, right? I just need to put that out there. Don't be like, "Mom, Dad, our youth pastor has murdered someone." No, I have not done that. But as Jesus says, a lot of these things pertain from the heart, right? And we're going to see how this actually even evolves or devolves, you want to say, because we go from having, you know, the experience of God and the innate knowledge of God and knowing that God is the creator of all things to then having, you know, giving ourselves over to lustful passions, to having a debased mind. So there's this de-evolution that happens with us. But it's this progress, right, of going from having known God to rejecting that there's a God to then doing these things. And so in the same sense, when it comes to sin, sin starts somewhere. It's not just, I'm not a sinner because I sin, because I do these actions. These actions come about because I am a sinner. That's who I am. That was my identity, right? And now, again, what's happened? I've been transformed. God has then, as he says, he's given me a new heart. I've been born again. The old man is dead and the new man is now alive. Essentially, I'm a completely new person, so I no longer identify in the things of a sinner, but I identify in the things of a saint, right? I now am a Christian, a saint, a follower of Jesus, and that is who I am. That's my position because of what he's done. It doesn't matter about what I do. Now, essentially what's going to happen, though, is because now I'm a saint and I've been born again, the fruits of a saint are going to be good things, good actions, good works, correct? Right? But it's not so much those good works and those good actions that make me a saint. It's the transformation of Jesus Christ, right? It's what he has done. It's who he is. And Paul is sharing with us basically this whole thing here in chapter 1, telling us, you know, of the gospel of Jesus Christ and how he is unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ and how he has come to preach salvation to everyone who believes, right? And he says that in verse 16. To who first? The Jew. And then who else is left? The Gentiles, right? So the Jews first, but the Gentiles also. To the Greeks. Right? He says in verse 17, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." I go from an identity of a sinner and the things that sinners do because I have placed my faith in the right person and the work of that person, and that being Jesus Christ. And that's why it's so important not to just live a life that is obedient to God and glorifying to God and has good fruits, but that we share these things with our words, right? Paul says it best, I think later on in Romans, how can someone be saved unless they hear like from a preacher, right? From someone who speaks. I'm not saying like you have to be a pastor or a preacher, but you can be in a sense in your schools, on the bus, at work, whatever it may be. We don't just live good, moral, righteous lives, but no, we have to share the gospel as well, right? So how can you be saved unless you hear, and how can you hear unless someone speaks, and how can they speak unless they are sent? Essentially, that's what he says, right? So our words have to match our lives. So he says that in verses 16 and 17, but then he gets into this downward spiral, I would say, for mankind when we begin to reject God. Just the notion that there is a God, right? Paul is making it very clear that you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to be super intelligent. You can be 5 years old and understand that there's a God, right? And how do we know that? I think there's a number of ways. I think the two main ways that Paul speaks of is just the innate being of ourselves, that God has put it in us to know that there's something greater than us, right? That he has put eternity in our hearts. So innately in us, we know that we are not the end-all, be-all. We know that we are not God, right? Now, if you thought you were God, I would challenge you on that and have you try to jump off some really high building, right? And at that point, you get to the ledge, you're like, you're right, I'm not God, right? So you understand that you're not God. Well, then there's another way that we can know that God is real, and that's just the fact of creation. Correct? Right? You show up at home. We talked about this. You show up home, when you leave here, and there's a sandwich sitting on the table. You didn't see it being made. Do you think someone made it? Or do you think it just appeared that way? Do you think it was just happenstance that everything just collided correctly and whatever and whatever? We just basically go against the law of nature and all the laws of physics, and we just believe that it just happened out of nowhere. No, like you understand that there's a creator because of creation, right? So you understand that there was someone who made the sandwich because there is a sandwich. We understand that there is a God, there is a higher being, an intelligent designer and creator based on creation itself, and you and I are that creation, along with everything else that we see. Now, the difference between us and the rest of creation is that we were made differently, right? We were made in the image and the likeness of God, correct? And so that's why we are different. We have a mind, body, soul, and spirit. You cannot say the same for the rest of creation, right? We have a free will. There's so much that we can do that's different than the rest of creation, whether we're talking about nature or animals. And so there's this downward spiral that happens once we start to reject the notion that there is a creator, that there is a God. Right? This downward spiral that Paul is going to speak of, and we didn't have a chance to study it ourselves in youth because we heard it in main service with Pastor Kevin. But in verse 24, if you look at this, in verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28, there's a commonality in common words and a common phrase that Paul's going to use. And it's the fact that he gives over. God gave them over. Do you guys see that in those verses? Verse 24, therefore God also gave them up. Right? Verse 26, for this reason God gave them up. Verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over. Right? The same thing is happening. It's this progression that's happening from bad to worse to the worst that there could be. Right? There's this de-evolution, as I would call it, because we're not evolving. Evolving would imply that it's getting better. But devolving is implying that it's getting worse. And this is what happens when sinful man reaches the point of us rejecting that there is a God. And when you reject that there's a God, you abandon God. And do you know what happens? In a sense, I will say it this way, in a sense, God abandons you. Because he gives you what you want. He doesn't abandon you in the sense that he stops loving you. He doesn't abandon you in the sense that he won't be there for you if you ever change your ways and your mind and you put your faith in him. That's not the type of abandonment I'm speaking of. I'm talking about the type of abandonment where he gives you what your heart desires. He lets you have free will, right? The fact that we can utterly despise God and we can say whatever we want to him and we can go against what he has designed for us as humans shows us that God has given us a free will, right? If God didn't give us a free will, then we wouldn't even have the ability to reject him. Wouldn't you agree? So if we reject and abandon God, he's eventually going to reject and abandon us because that's what we want. That's what we desire. And I think as we go through these verses, it's going to be pretty clear, even as Paul is writing to the Romans, 2,000 years ago, to the Romans about 2,000 years ago, this is really going to hit home for us even today, for us as people in 2024, but even for those of us, all of us, that live in this nation called America. America is a wonderful nation, but it's also filled with sin. And I think you guys are old enough and smart enough to understand, even not having lived as long as I or some of these older people in here, that that our country has completely flipped upside down just in the past 10, 15 years, just in the past 4 years. It absolutely blows my mind. And I hope you can understand this. I hope you can really take this in, because when I was your age, I didn't really keep up with world events. I didn't really keep up with what was happening in my country. I kind of just lived in a bubble. It wasn't on purpose, it's just how I lived, right? I didn't understand things. But I need you to understand that the things that were wrong are now right. The things that were right are now wrong. Everything has been flipped upside down in the country that we live in. And it's not just our country, but I'm speaking to our country because we live here. And a lot of it starts here. And a lot of it is being accepted and allowed here. And we see this with a lot of the LGBTQ movement. We see it a lot with abortion. We see it a lot with the politics, stuff that is happening in your public schools, things that are being allowed. When I was in San Diego this past week, the governor in San Diego signed into law that teachers do not have to tell parents if their students come in and they want to use a different pronoun or if they want to change their gender. It is no longer do they have to go and tell parents. Now, I know you guys aren't parents yet, but I need you to understand that my children are my responsibility, right? And let me even say it this way. I'm your youth pastor, right? You're not my responsibility. Do you understand that? Like I don't raise you. Thank God I don't raise you. You guys eat way too much. But the point is that I'm here to come alongside your parents. They're the ones that are to raise you. They're the ones that are to teach you and guide you. They're the ones that are responsible for you, right? And maybe it's not biological parents. Maybe it's guardians. I don't know, right? Maybe it's a stepmom, a stepmother, or a father. But the point being is that here now what is once considered, right is now wrong, and wrong is right. And to me, that absolutely blows my mind that parents they're not involved. They are being kicked out of raising their children, and that the school would have the responsibility to do that. And we're not talking about like little things, guys. We're not talking about like, this is my favorite color. We're talking about absolutely destroying your life by changing your gender, right? I mean, this is a huge deal. And this was signed into law. This isn't just like, hey, we prefer this. No, this is law now. And this isn't the only law that's been in effect. We see a lot of others that where up is down and down is up and left is right and wrong is right. Like all these things, they're being backwards. And so what's going to happen is that God is, as we continue to do these things, we see God allowing us to do these things because this is what we want. This is the world and the country that we live in, that those who have rejected God, now God is giving them over to these things. It's like, what should we expect? Like, we shouldn't even be shocked, right? If God is giving us debased minds, basically meaning like dumb, you're going to start doing dumb things. And hear me out. When you're in sin, you start to do some dumb things and think dumb ways, right? You don't have a clear mind. There is no clarity in sin. Just like this. Sin is always pictured as darkness, right? Is there any clarity in darkness? Is there any way that you can stand firm and walk firm and know where you're going when it's completely dark? No, not at all. You need light, right? And so once we have that light, when we're born again and transformed, I have a clarity and understanding of what is right, what is wrong, what is moral, what is good, what is bad. But it only comes from that. So in verse 24, Paul says, therefore, which brings us back to the verses that were preceding that, where we learn in verses 18 through 23 that God has revealed himself to man. Again, I said this, not just externally in creation, but also the knowledge of God is built into us, right? That eventually what can happen is that if we don't accept that, if we don't believe that, we start to suppress this knowledge and reject the evidence and the truth about God, and then we come up with our own reasonings for the cause and the origin of things, right? If there is no God, then how do you get your standard for what is right and wrong? How do you get your standard for morality? You don't. You have to get it from someone who is moral, who is righteous, and who is good, and who has designed and created those things. It is not a relative thing, right? It is not something that you think and you come up with what is right and wrong, and I'll think what I come up with what is right and wrong, and then we just go with what is the majority. No, that's not good. That's a chaotic and evil and wicked world. Because think of it this way. Have you guys heard of the Holocaust? Yeah? Do you guys know how many Jews were killed or murdered? 6 million? 2 years ago, I got to go actually to Auschwitz in Poland. And I got to see, I didn't get to see exactly what happened, but I was there, I saw the chambers, I saw all their stuff. It became really real to me that how horrific this was. 6 million Jews. And I think in Auschwitz they killed, I think, about 1 to 2 million just in that concentration camp. And do you know that when it came to Hitler and the Germans, that what they did, they did not think they were doing was wrong? Did you know that? They thought what they were doing was right. They thought it was righteous. They thought it was good. Right? So here we've got millions of people who think that murdering 6 million Jews was good and righteous. Would you agree with that? Probably not, right? Probably not. Well, where's the difference here? How did the Germans come to that conclusion? The point being is that we cannot come up with our own morality. We cannot come up with what is good and what is bad. We have to get that standard from someone greater and more intelligent than us, and someone who has decided, or not even decided, it's because of who he is, because God is righteous and good, that anything apart from him is going to be the opposite. So we have to get it from him. But if you start to suppress that, the knowledge of him, you start to come up with your own reasonings, right? You start to substitute with other gods. You start to abandon the one true God, and then God's going to say, I'm going to give you up to those things. And part of God giving us up to these things is so that we can deal with the consequences of them. Right? That is part of his wrath towards us. God is righteous, he is good. And if you decide, I reject you, I don't believe you, I'm going to abandon you, God's going to be like, okay. And part of your consequences of your decisions of rejecting and abandoning him is going to come back to bite you. Because when you move away from the life giver, the life sustainer, the one who is good and holy and loving, you're not going to find any of that stuff away from him. I hope this makes sense. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have to deal with all the things that you have decided to do. And it's going to be hard. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. And in one sense, I think it's good, because then you might actually come to the realization that the gods that I have decided and come up with cannot at all give me what I am looking for. They can't. God says this to the Israelites. He's like, dude, you keep coming back to me when things are bad. Why don't you go to the gods that you worship when it's good? Go to your God that you built with your hands and have them save you. You're in a pickle right now. Go pray to them. You know what the Israelites do? They're like, dude, we know that they're not going to do anything. It's like me praying to that wall and asking that wall to help me with my marriage. What do you think the wall's going to do for me? Nothing. I'll probably just smash my head against the wall, and that might help. But you would look at me like I'm absolutely stupid if I told you that's what I was doing. once you come to a clarity and understanding, you'd be like, yeah, that's dumb. That does nothing. We have a monotheistic faith, meaning that there is one God. There is not multiple gods. There is not, that your religion's right, this religion's right, that this God's here and that God's here. That cannot be the case, and it is not the case. So you either believe in the one true God, or you abandon him and you reject him. And again, there's consequences to that, because God gives us over. We see this in verse 24, 26, and 28. God gives us over. Let's look at this. Let's start in verse 28. I don't have time to get into all this, so I'm going to jump into verse 28. In verse 28, Paul says this, after he just speaks about, actually, let me read it to you in verses 24. He says, therefore, God also gave them up to what? Uncleanliness, and the lusts of their hearts. Again, where does everything originate? The heart. All of our actions originate from the heart. All of our words that we say originate from the heart. Okay? So your actions and your words are just the fruit and the evidence of what's inside of you. And God did not come to change your actions and your words. He came to change your heart, the source of it all. Right? The heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. And so he came to transform us and give us a new heart. And I'm so thankful he did. Because what does the heart say? What is the heart and what does it do? In Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, I think it's on the screen. Jeremiah says this. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things, which is the opposite of what the world says. Right? You guys know the song, Listen to Your Heart? Right? Or the phrase and the encouragement to follow your heart. Right? And now, I don't think those are necessarily bad unless that heart has been crucified, unless that heart has been changed, unless you have decided to pick up your cross and follow Jesus first. Right? I'm not going to follow my sinful heart. I'm going to follow the new heart that God has given me. So Jeremiah, again, he says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? But God, he goes on and he gives us a new heart, the Bible tells us. Again, it's in the heart that it begins. In verse 25, let me continue. He gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves. There's this progression that if God gives you up to uncleanliness and to the passions and lusts of your heart, it's going to result in us dishonoring our bodies among ourselves, who exchanged the truth of God for what? A lie, and worshipped and served the creature, us, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason, it says that God gave them up to vile passions. Vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. You guys understand what that means. I don't need to go in depth on that. Pastor Kevin already did. Likewise, also to men, two genders. Women can do it, men can do it. They go against what is natural, right? We all understand what is natural. You either have to play ignorant or play stupid or just flat out reject it, knowing it's the truth, to say that these things are natural, right? The things that aren't natural, to say that they are, right? When we start to go against what is truth, and we start to make up, and make up our own world and our own truths, well, they don't stand because they don't have legs and a foundation to stand on. Right? It goes back to, I'm going to share this with you. When the world starts to believe that a man can become a woman and that you can change your gender, and hear me out, listen to me, you can change your gender just because you want to. The question then is, oftentimes that I see and hear is, well then now define to me what a woman is. You guys ever heard that? What is a woman? Right? And when you try to reject the truth and exchange the truth for a lie, your answers that go against the truth are going to sound absolutely stupid. And they always do. And I've never heard a good answer to it, because you can't. You can't add lie upon lie to make it sound like it's truth. It's eventually going to reveal itself that it's absolutely stupid. And so oftentimes they will answer the question of what is a woman with someone who identifies as a woman. Why is that a dumb answer? because you can't define something using the actual word of it, right? That's like saying, what is an apple tree? What is an apple? And you're like, something that's an apple. Like, well, you still haven't told me what it is, right? This is what I'm trying to get at, is that you exchange the truth of God for the lie. When we start to do that, we don't make any sense anymore. And it's very easy to know what is truth and what is not truth. So we exchange the truth of God for the lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason, God gave them up for vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. What once was shameful is no longer shameful, right? And we're seeing this. What once was wrong is now becoming right. Again, you guys are young. You don't know what happened 15, 20, 30 years ago. I don't know what, I didn't see it with my eyes, but I do know history, and I know you do too. But some of these things that we're seeing in Northern America are things that once used to be shameful. The sin that once used to be like, we're not going to talk about it, it's going to be hidden. But now we see it just evident in the streets. We see it in the classrooms. We see it in books. We see it in social media. It is just something that is rampant and is welcomed and it is okay, right? I don't want to see homosexual men walking around naked in the streets of San Francisco because they have some parade that they want to, promote, any more than I want to see a heterosexual, woman naked on the streets, right? But the point is, you do see that, I guess, but that it's becoming more and more accepted, right? And it's being pushed into certain things in certain areas. So you've given up what is natural for what is unnatural. And he says this in verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind. So we know that there's evidence of a God. It's obvious. But then when we start to reject that, God gives us over to certain things. And this last thing that God gives us over to is the fact that we first start not retaining God in our knowledge, just knowing that He is real. That we have tested it, but God hasn't failed it, but we have failed it. That we tested God's revelation, but we didn't approve of it, and we didn't accept it. He flunked their test. But what God is going to do is He's going to flunk them in the next verse, or in this next half of the verse. So what does God do? He gives them over to a debased mind. The word debased here refers to a mind that will not stand the test of accepting God's order of things. That I will not surrender and submit to God's design. It speaks of an unapproved mind. It actually speaks of like metal or coins. Right? Metal or coins that are found to be worthless and no value. Basically, they become useless and rejected. The same is true of a depraved or debased mind. It's found to be worthless and possessing nothing of value. The smartest and the most intelligent of people that live on our earth have this worthless and depraved mind of no value. Because they have abandoned God, and God has abandoned them and given them this depraved mind so that their wickedness can be fulfilled. They've lost all ability to reason. They've become corrupt, and they've rejected the very things of God. This means that their intellectual faculties, their conscience, is so destroyed that they cannot do anything moral. By testing things and finding that they are bad and ought to be rejected, they will actually end up accepting them and approving of them. And they will test things that ought to be accepted and admired, and then they will reject those things. Again, does this not sound like the society that we live in today? He goes on to say in verse 28 that God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. Right? Not fitting means not becoming or shameful. Like there's certain things that we would not do because we have a conscience and we have the Holy Spirit in us because we know they're shameful. Right? There's certain things that you would not do in like a religious setting. Right? You guys will sometimes say, you're not allowed to say that in church. Right? Because you have this respect and honor. Well, this is going out the door for someone who has a debased mind, that there is no respect and there is no honor for what is righteous and what is pure. Titus chapter 1, verse 15 says this. I think it's on the screen. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and their conscience are defiled. Paul goes on in verse 29. Let's try and close this up. Being filled with what? 23 things that Paul lists here. Really 22, because unrighteousness covers all of it. Being filled with unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers. This list gives us a general picture of people who reject God and His revelation, who have been given over to these things by God. They are the consequence of us abandoning and rejecting God. So here's the list. I'm going to go through this quickly. The first one is unrighteousness. It's basically the opposite of righteousness. It's an unrighteous heart of life. It's to have an injustice. Number 2, sexual morality. The Greek word is porneia, which I'm sure you can obviously guess where we get the English word for porn. It's sexual immorality. It includes every form of illegitimate sex or illicit sex. Number 3, wickedness. It's the lack of morality. Basically to be a villain, right? These people, they take delight in evil. It's a general inclination, again, towards evil. Number 4, covetousness. It's the inordinate desire to have more. It comes from the Greek word, or 2 Greek words, to have and more. It is an unlimited selfishness. Number 5 is maliciousness. It's to have ill will, to desire to injure. Envy. It means to desire to deprive others of what they have. The word not only desires what others have, but seeks to deprive them of what they have. This is what envy is here. Murder. You guys know what that is. This is actually the ultimate outcome of envy. Envy is at the heart of many murders. Murder is the unlawful taking of a life. Strife. Strife, it's a quarrelsome disposition with its active elements. It's an expression of enmity. It is contentious and has a rivalry with others. Basically, someone loves to argue all the time. They have an argumentative spirit. Number 9, deceit. It means what we like using. Have you guys ever gone fishing? And how you use bait to trick, to catch that fish? Right? That's what deceit, it carries that idea of deceiving the fish with a lure. Number 10, evil-mindedness. It speaks of bad character, a depravity of heart and life. It's people who operate with spite. Number 11, and the last one in this verse, is whisperers. And I need to encourage you with this because this is not something that's just rampant among teenagers, but it's rampant even among adults. And whisperers are those who gossip. And Paul is going to clump these things in together because they're just as bad as the next. This is what you will produce once given over to your debased mind. This is what you are going to be a part of, and this is what you're going to do. This is not who we are as Christians. Remember, God has saved us and redeemed us. Such were some of us. This is no longer us. But to gossip, it's people who love to slander in a sense, really in a secret sense. They collect lies and distortions, and they want to hurt others. And what we need to realize is that gossip is deadly. Verse 30, it says, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, and disobedient to parents. Backbiters essentially goes along with whisperers, but it's more open. Literally, the word means to talk back. They spread lies about other people far and wide. It basically takes gossip a step further and does it out in the public. What whisperers do in secret, slanderers do in the open. Haters of God. That's self-explanatory. You hate God. Verse 14, violent. It's one who, when they're uplifted with pride, either heaps insulting language upon others or does them some shameful act of wrong. It's a person who thinks of himself as superior to others and treats others below him. Number 15 is proud, showing oneself above others, despising others. 16 is boasters, a person who pretends to be what he is not. Number 17, inventors of evil things. Sin is sin. It's still the same. There's not a new sin under the sun since the beginning of time. There's just new ways to sin. There's new inventions of these evil things. These people have an ingenuity in inventing wrong. And number 18, this is a good one for all of us in here today, is disobedient to parents. This sin, and I need you to understand that this is a huge deal. That this is not the reflection of a born-again Christian to be disobedient to parents. I mean, it's so important that God puts it in the Ten Commandments. It's so important that he puts it in there with don't kill someone, right? You're like, that's obvious. Yeah, like, I'm not going to do that. That's pretty bad. Well, there's a reason that this is in there too. For you to be disobedient to your parents is to reject the very first authority in your life. And once you reject that very first authority in your life, you're going to reject every authority that comes with that and after that. Your employer, your teachers, your government, the people above you in any sense. And that's not good, because what that does is it causes disorder and chaos to a place where God has created order and roles. And we must submit to those. In verse 31, there's 5 more things here, 5 sins beginning with the prefix un. Right? This repetition, it speaks of importance and a force here, that we are to not do these things. So he says undiscerning. It means to be unintelligent without understanding. Right? These people are unintelligent because they choose a system for coming to truth other than God's revelation. Then there's untrustworthy, meaning that there's a covenant breaking, a faithlessness. They break agreements or covenants. They're not reliable. Unloving, it's without natural affection. Unsociable, inhuman. Unforgiving, it means without mercy, without pity. These are people who are ruthless. And unmerciful, the last one. Those without mercy have no capacity to identify with people in trouble. There's no compassion. They're just bloodthirsty. They can't seriously consider the needs of others and the things that they're going through and suffering with. And verse 32, last verse, says who, speaking of all those people, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. Paul paints it out clearly, that the revelation of God is very clear, and it's a downward spiral once you start to reject the evidence of God, because it's so very evident, that you start to go in a downward spiral that God gives you over to so that you can receive what you are due and what you have earned. Okay, again, it's nature. It's natural. What did I say? God is good, He's loving, He's holy, He's righteous, He's the life sustainer. When you reject that and move away from that, it's not what is, I guess, the cause and effect, but He doesn't just decide that this is what you're going to have. This is what naturally happens because you move away from it. Right? If you move away from the sun, the further you get away from it, what's going to happen? It's going to get a little colder, and it's going to get a little darker. Wouldn't you agree? Did the sun come up with that? Is that what he decided when you decided to walk away from it? No, obviously. It's just natural. That's what happens. Same thing with God. And so people will end up being what we see here in verses 29, 30, and 31. And what they deserve for that is not just the consequences that come here on earth when we have to deal with that, but also for eternity is a separation from God and a judgment from a righteous God, and it's not going to be good. But does God desire that for us? Does He want us to go through these things? Does He want us to receive grace or condemnation? Which one? Grace, right? He wants us to receive grace. His heart and His desires, not for us to be hurt, not for us to be cast away from Him for eternity, but to be with Him for eternity. And that is the gospel message of why He sent His only Son to die on our behalf. Jesus did not have to. God did not have to send Him. but because he loves us, he wanted to. He wanted to redeem us back to him. I need you to understand that. But because God is just and righteous, that if you reject any of that, you have to receive what is the natural response. And it's a righteous judgment. And he says this, those who practice such things are deserving of death, and not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. And that's the world that we're living in now, that it's not only those who practice these things, but even those who approve of them. And we have to be a people that says, I don't approve of that. And it's not unloving to say, I don't approve of you being a murderer. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. Well, it's the same for every single thing that we see in this list of 23 things. That it's not unloving to say, I don't approve of that. That is not how God designed us. That is not the nature of God and what he has created.